A black woman walks onto a plane, casually dressed, holding a first-class ticket, but the crew tells her she doesn't belong. What they don't realize? She owns the entire airline. And in the next 5 minutes, she fires the entire staff on the spot. This isn't just a story about power, it's about respect, dignity, and a moment that shocked the world. Ma'am, first class is for premium passengers only. Those 6 words silenced the air around gate A12. The terminal, just moments ago buzzing with the quiet chatter of boarding passengers and rolling suitcases, suddenly felt still. People turned their heads. Eyes widened. A few gasped, unsure of what they were witnessing. A woman stood at the threshold of the jet bridge, stunned but composed. She wore a simple black hoodie, faded jeans, white sneakers, and no makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she carried only a small leather bag over her shoulder. To any outsider, she looked like just another traveler, perhaps flying coach, maybe on standby. But she wasn't. She had just handed her first-class boarding pass to the flight attendant, who took one look not at the ticket but at her. At her clothes. At her hair. At her skin. And that's when the attendant uttered the words that echoed like thunder in a quiet storm, "Coach is that way." Passengers nearby froze. Some exchanged glances. Others looked away awkwardly. A man too rose back, pulled out his phone, sensing that something uncomfortable, perhaps important, was happening. The woman, still silent, glanced down at her ticket. It clearly read first class, seat 2A. She hadn't said a word yet. Her silence was powerful, controlled. Not out of fear, but out of familiarity. Because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She had seen this scene play out before. On other flights. In boardrooms. At luxury stores. At charity galas. Over and over again. It was always the same pattern. Judgment based on appearance. Assumptions based on race. Disrespect disguised as policy. But this time? They didn't just pick the wrong passenger. They picked the owner of the airline. Her name was Danielle Rivers, and she wasn't just a business traveler. She was the founder and CEO of SkyLux Airways, the very airline this crew worked for. She had built this company from scratch, one that stood for luxury, safety, and dignity in the skies. Not just for the wealthy, but for anyone who deserved respect. And she had done it as a black woman in an industry dominated by white male executives. She'd faced walls and broken them. Faced doors and kicked them open. And now, the irony of the moment was almost poetic. Still, Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. She simply raised one eyebrow and looked the attendant in the eye, calmly. "Is that so?" The flight attendant, still unaware, nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am." "You'll need to move back to economy. Or we can call someone to assist you." A second crew member joined her. She leaned in and whispered, not as quietly as she thought, "These people always try to sneak in." It wasn't just a comment. It was a confirmation. Danielle's lips parted slightly. Not in shock. In disappointment. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, she made a call. "Hi. This is Rivers. I need airport operations at gate A12. Now." The crew member frowned. "Ma'am, who exactly are you calling?" Danielle glanced at her. Her eyes were calm. But beneath that calm, there was fire. "You'll find out soon enough," she said coolly. Within 5 minutes, 2 airport security officers arrived, followed closely by 2 sharply dressed executives in navy suits bearing SkyLux badges. One of them practically jogged toward her. "Ms. Rivers, we are so sorry. We're handling it immediately." The crew froze. "Ms. Rivers?" The lead flight attendant's expression twisted into horror. She's the CEO?" One whispered, barely audible over the rush of blood in her ears. Danielle turned toward the staff and stood tall. "I expect every SkyLux employee to treat every passenger with dignity. I came here today expecting to fly peacefully. Instead, I was judged, embarrassed, and spoken down to on my own aircraft. That's not just unprofessional. It's unacceptable." Her words were sharp, but not angry. Each syllable landed like a hammer. "I'm relieving this crew of duty effective immediately. Remove them from this flight. We'll conduct further reviews later." As the stunned flight attendants were escorted off the aircraft, passengers broke into applause. Not because someone lost their job, but because someone had finally said what many had felt for so long: respect is not based on your outfit, your skin tone, or your seat number. It should be standard. Danielle took her seat in 2A, pulled out her laptop, and continued working as if nothing happened. But something had happened. A line had been drawn. And millions would soon hear the story of the CEO who didn't raise her voice, she just raised the standard. Danielle Rivers wasn't born with wealth. She wasn't handed connections or silver spoons. She was born in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and lights in the house. Danielle grew up watching her mother endure, persist, and carry dignity through struggle. That woman was her first definition of strength. And from an early age, Danielle knew she would build something greater, something that honored where she came from, but also broke the barriers placed in front of her. She was brilliant, focused, and determined. She graduated top of her class in business school, navigated the competitive world of corporate America, and eventually became a successful investor. But despite her growing success, there was one place where she always felt unseen: airports. Discrimination at 30,000 feet. Danielle traveled constantly for work. Meetings, pitches, conferences, you name it. But almost every time she flew, especially when seated in first class, she was met with skepticism, side glances, and comments that dripped with microaggressions. Flight attendants would double-check her boarding pass, assuming she was lost. Passengers would assume she was a celebrity, not a businesswoman. Some staff would speak to her slowly or dismissively, assuming she didn't belong. After one particularly humiliating flight where a crew member loudly questioned how she afforded first class, Danielle made a promise to herself. One day, I won't just fly the plane. I'll own it. The birth of SkyLux Airways. That promise became a vision. That vision became a business plan. And within 4 years, that business plan became SkyLux Airways, an elite, black-owned airline committed to exceptional service, luxury, and respect for all passengers. Danielle didn't build SkyLux to impress investors. She built it because the skies had never been equal ground. She built it because too many people had been overlooked, undervalued, and judged before they even took their seats. SkyLux quickly grew from a boutique charter company into a full-fledged commercial airline, offering routes across the U.S. and beyond. Its slogan? Luxury without judgment. And every member of staff was trained, not just in hospitality, but in humanity. Danielle personally oversaw hiring, culture, and onboard experience. She made sure her airline didn't just serve passengers. It saw them. The flight that changed everything. One crisp morning, Danielle was set to speak at a global leadership summit in New York, a gathering of CEOs, innovators, and changemakers. But for once, she didn't want to arrive with press or PR. She wanted peace. No assistants. No flashing cameras. No designer suits. So she boarded one of her own SkyLux flights. Alone, dressed in a casual black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. She carried a small bag and wore no jewelry. To most, she looked like a young professional. To the untrained, or perhaps biased eye, she looked like someone flying coach. The crew didn't recognize her, and that was the problem. As she walked toward her first-class seat, boarding pass in hand, one of the flight attendants looked her up and down. No greeting. No smile. Just a question disguised as a command. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right section?" Danielle simply held out her ticket. The attendant barely glanced at it before gesturing toward the back of the plane. "Coach is that way," she said, flatly. Danielle raised her eyebrow. Not in shock, but in recognition. This moment wasn't new. It was just the latest chapter in a book she knew far too well. But this time, it hit different. Because this was her airline. Her plane. Her crew. And they had no idea. She didn't want special treatment. Just respect. Danielle wasn't looking for a red carpet. She wasn't testing her team or playing secret shopper. She was just a woman trying to fly in peace, without being judged by her outfit, her skin, or her solo presence. But the moment she was mistaken for not belonging, it exposed a truth deeper than inconvenience. Bias hides everywhere, even in the house you build yourself. And as Danielle stood silently in front of that crew, boarding pass still in hand, she knew what needed to happen next. This wasn't about punishment. It was about standards. About accountability. And above all, about the very reason she built SkyLux in the first place. Actually, I think you'll be the one exiting. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. What started as a misunderstanding had now evolved into something uglier, louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. Danielle Rivers stood calmly, first-class boarding pass in hand. She wasn't making a scene. She didn't need to. The scene was unfolding around her. And everyone was watching. The initial flight attendant had already tried to shoo her toward coach, making assumptions based on her clothes, her skin, and her quiet demeanor. But now, 2 more crew members had joined in, crowding around her, all without even asking her name or checking her reservation again. One leaned in, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, how loud she was when she whispered, "These people always try to sneak in here." The words cut through the air like a blade. Sharp. Racist. Dehumanizing. And they didn't go unheard. A woman seated in 3B gasped. A man in a business suit across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back of the cabin quietly raised their phone and began recording. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She didn't defend herself. She simply pulled out her phone, unlocked it with one swipe, and calmly pressed a single contact, Operations Director, SkyLux HQ. The call connected instantly. "This is Rivers. Get me airport operations to gate A12. Now." Her voice was calm, steady, and businesslike, like someone confirming the weather or placing an espresso order. She ended the call in less than 10 seconds. The lead flight attendant, still unaware of who she was dealing with, let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes like a teenager. "Ma'am," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm, "I'm going to have to ask you to move or exit the plane. You're holding up boarding." Passengers shifted in their seats. The audacity. The lack of respect. The sheer entitlement in her voice. Danielle slowly turned her head, locking eyes with the attendant. She didn't blink. And then came the words that silenced the entire aircraft, "Actually, I think you'll be the one exiting." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was laced with power, real power, the kind that doesn't come from raising your volume, but from knowing exactly who you are, and what you've built. The lead flight attendant frowned, confused. "Excuse me?" Danielle slowly, deliberately reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek, engraved SkyLux identification card. The kind only issued to C-level executives. Underneath the logo, it read, "Danielle Rivers, founder and chief executive officer," and just like that, the energy in the cabin shifted. One of the junior flight attendants took a small step backward. The others looked at each other, unsure of what to say. Danielle continued, her voice still controlled but firm, "Let me be absolutely clear. You are employees of my airline. And today, on my aircraft, you chose to speak down to a passenger without verifying their ticket, their name, or their dignity. You made assumptions. You disrespected me. And by doing so, you disrespected the very mission this company was built on." No one moved. No one dared speak. From the economy section, a few people peeked up the aisle, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Exactly 5 minutes later, 2 members of airport operations arrived at the cabin door, accompanied by a SkyLux senior vice president who had rushed across the terminal from a nearby gate. The VP immediately approached Danielle. "Ms. Rivers. We are so sorry. We'll handle this immediately." Danielle nodded slightly, never taking her eyes off the crew. "I'd like the entire crew relieved of duty," she said firmly. "Effective immediately. Remove them from this flight. We will debrief with HR and legal later." The operations officer stepped forward and asked the attendants to gather their belongings. The lead flight attendant's face went pale. "But I didn't know," she stammered. "That's exactly the problem," Danielle said quietly. "You didn't know. And you didn't ask. You just assumed." As the crew was escorted off the plane, the first-class cabin remained completely silent. Then, slowly, one by one, passengers began to applaud. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rowdy. It was respectful. Appreciative. Not because someone had been fired, but because someone finally stood up. Not with anger. Not with violence. But with calm, undeniable power. Danielle took her seat in 2A, pulled out her laptop, and resumed reading her notes for the leadership summit. She didn't need to post about it. She didn't need to trend online. The people on that flight would remember that moment forever. Because true leadership doesn't scream. It doesn't flex. It just shows up and commands respect. Whether in a suit or a hoodie, the silence on the plane was deafening. 5 minutes had passed since Danielle Rivers had made a call no one understood at the time. 5 minutes since a woman in a hoodie quietly exercised her power without raising her voice or needing to prove anything. Then came the footsteps. Measured. Urgent. 2 airport operations officials boarded the aircraft, followed closely by 2 men in tailored suits, both wearing silver SkyLux Airways pins clipped to their lapels. The suited man in front moved fast, his expression tight, serious. When he saw Danielle, his face shifted into immediate apology. No confusion. No hesitation. He knew exactly who she was. "Ms. Rivers," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're so sorry. We're handling it right now." He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for her version of events. Because he knew if Danielle Rivers had called operations directly, something had gone terribly wrong. Reality hits the crew. The flight crew stood frozen. The lead flight attendant, still clutching her tablet, blinked slowly as realization sank in. Her expression shifted from confident to confused and finally to something close to fear. "Wait, you're Ms. Rivers," she whispered, though the whisper carried. Danielle didn't respond to her question directly. She didn't need to. Instead, she stood up slowly from seat 2A, adjusted the sleeves of her hoodie, and took one quiet, deliberate step toward the crew. All eyes were on her. Passengers leaned in. Some were already texting. Others were still filming, sensing they were witnessing something that didn't happen often, a moment when power didn't hide behind PR statements or legal silence. Danielle looked at the cabin crew. Not with anger, but with clarity. "I expect every employee of this airline to treat our passengers with dignity and respect," she began, her voice calm and unwavering. "That's not a request. That's the standard. One we set from day one." She looked around the cabin, then back at the attendants who had judged her based solely on her appearance. "You didn't just fail that standard. You failed it on my flight, in my presence. And with a level of casual cruelty that tells me this isn't the first time you've treated someone this way. No drama. Just decisions." No one dared speak. The cabin, from first class to the last row in coach, was so still you could hear the soft hum of the air vents above. Danielle turned toward the airport operations officer standing at the front of the plane. "Remove them from duty. Effective immediately." Her words weren't shouted. They weren't fueled by rage. They were firm. Professional. Final. The kind of words that didn't allow space for debate. The operations officer nodded without hesitation. He stepped forward and spoke quietly to the flight crew. "Please gather your things and step off the aircraft. We'll debrief with you shortly." The lead attendant's mouth opened slightly, like she wanted to protest, but she didn't. What could she say? She had spoken down to the CEO of the airline. Disrespected the very woman who signed the paychecks. All because she wore sneakers instead of heels, a hoodie instead of a blazer, and melanin instead of privilege. One by one, the crew collected their belongings and began walking down the aisle toward the exit. They didn't look at the passengers. They didn't speak. The shame was loud enough. The cabin reacts as the crew disappeared off the plane. A pause lingered in the air. Then a woman in row 4 began clapping. 1 or 2 others joined in. Then more. The applause wasn't wild. It wasn't loud. It was respectful. Appreciative. Because everyone in that cabin knew they hadn't just witnessed someone being held accountable. They had witnessed what real leadership looked like. Danielle Rivers didn't need to scream to be heard. She didn't throw a tantrum. She didn't ask for revenge. She simply drew the line and stood on the right side of it. Leading by example, Danielle returned to her seat without fanfare. She opened her laptop and resumed reading her speech for the leadership summit she was traveling to. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her speech was about how companies can embody their values at every level. Not just in marketing. Not just in statements. But in the real choices leaders make. Today, she didn't just give that message. She lived it. Passengers across the plane sat in silence, many still processing what they had just seen. They'd forget the in-flight meal. They'd forget the movie they watched. But they'd never forget the moment a quiet black woman in a hoodie reminded everyone what real power looks like. The cabin door clicked shut. The disgraced flight crew had been escorted off the plane, eyes down, mouths shut, their confidence drained by the weight of their mistake. Not a single word had been exchanged on the way out. The silence they left behind spoke louder than anything they could have said. And still, Danielle Rivers didn't say much either. No fist pumping. No, I told you so. No ego. No gloating. No revenge. She simply walked back to seat 2A, adjusted the small travel pillow behind her, and sat down. With grace. With strength. With purpose. Clapping for more than justice, it started slowly. A woman in 3D clapped, soft, respectful. Then a man in a suit near the front joined in. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the first-class cabin filled with applause, not loud and rowdy, but heartfelt and deliberate. The kind of applause that said, "Thank you for standing up. Thank you for making this moment matter. Thank you for doing what most people wouldn't dare." But they weren't applauding because someone lost their job. They were applauding because someone finally stood up to a problem that had always been there. Just quietly tolerated. Danielle had done what so many had dreamed of doing, calling out discrimination the moment it happened, and holding people accountable right then and there. And not just as a passenger, but as the CEO. The founder. The boss. The internet responds. By the time the plane landed, the world already knew. A video, just under 2 minutes long, had gone viral. It was shaky and grainy, filmed by a passenger seated near the front, but it captured everything that mattered. Danielle standing, calm and composed. The moment she uttered, "Remove them from duty." Effective immediately. The stunned crew. The quiet applause. The quiet power. The video hit 25 million views in a single day. One clip was captioned, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." Another, "A hoodie, sneakers, and grace under fire." That's how you run an airline. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural wave. People around the world, especially black professionals, women, and travelers of color, began sharing their own stories of being ignored, judged, or mistreated in luxury spaces. Suddenly, Danielle Rivers wasn't just a name. She was a symbol. The statement heard around the world. SkyLux Airways released an official statement the next morning. But Danielle's own message came first. Posted on her personal LinkedIn, Instagram, and company channels, it read simply, "Respect is not optional. Not in the skies. Not on the ground. Not ever. No press conference. No long explanation. Just a truth so clear, it didn't need anything else." The post was shared over 10,000 times within the hour. Celebrities, CEOs, and everyday passengers praised her for showing that power isn't just in what you say, it's in how you act when the spotlight finds you unprepared. Danielle hadn't planned to go viral. She had planned to take a quiet flight. But instead, she became a voice for millions. Quiet strength, loud impact. The leadership summit she was headed to? She still attended. Her keynote was standing room only. Attendees didn't want to hear corporate jargon. They wanted to hear the woman who turned a moment of injustice into a lesson on accountability, professionalism, and leadership with integrity. During her talk, Danielle said, "You don't fix culture with emails and slogans. You fix it with action, especially when no one expects you to take it." A new standard in the skies. In the following weeks, SkyLux Airways announced updated sensitivity training, new accountability protocols, and a passenger-first program focused on equity and dignity for all. Other airlines followed suit. But none of them could replicate what happened on that flight. Because it wasn't just about a policy change. It was about a woman in a hoodie, with more power in her silence than most have in their title, reminding the world that respect isn't earned by clothes or class. It's a human right. And Danielle Rivers? She just made sure the sky was no longer the limit for fairness. This story isn't just about a CEO showing her power. It's not about ego. It's not about revenge. It's not even just about race. It's about what happens when a person chooses not to stay silent in the face of disrespect. When they decide that dignity is not something they'll negotiate, no matter who's watching or how inconvenient it might be. Danielle Rivers could have walked away. She could have let the humiliation slide. She could have taken her seat quietly, swallowed the pain, and chalked it up to just another day as a black woman moving through a world built to doubt her. And no one would have blamed her. But she didn't. Because when you've worked your entire life to build something meaningful, staying silent becomes a betrayal, not just of yourself, but of everyone who comes after you. Leadership without a title isn't real leadership. Danielle wasn't angry. She wasn't loud. She didn't throw accusations. She didn't embarrass anyone with insults. She didn't need to. Because true leadership doesn't shout. It stands. It stands when it's easier to sit down. It speaks when silence is more comfortable. It acts when action is risky. Danielle didn't act for the cameras. She didn't know someone was filming. She acted because every moment of inaction gives permission to injustice, and she refused to be part of that permission. More than herself, this wasn't just about Danielle protecting her own name or her own pride. She was thinking of the young black girl who will board a flight someday, nervous in her new shoes and blazer, hoping to be seen as professional enough. She was thinking of the immigrant father, boarding a flight to a job interview in another state, judged before he even takes his seat. She was thinking of every person who's ever been told, without words, that they don't belong somewhere they've worked hard to be. Danielle understood, if she let this moment slide, she'd be telling the world it was okay to treat people this way. And it's not okay. Not in the air. Not in offices. Not in boardrooms. Not in schools. Not anywhere. The power of calm. What made Danielle's response so powerful wasn't just what she did. It was how she did it. She didn't match rudeness with rudeness. She didn't allow the flight crew's ignorance to shake her identity. She stood in her truth, held her ground, and used her authority not to crush, but to correct. She reminded the crew that authority is a responsibility, not a weapon. And she reminded the world that black excellence doesn't always arrive in designer suits and press photos. Sometimes, it walks in wearing a hoodie and sneakers and still commands the room. Redefining what power looks like. So often, society expects powerful people to look the part. But Danielle shattered that expectation. She proved that real power isn't about appearances. It's about presence. It's about character. It's about knowing who you are even when others try to reduce you to who they assume you are. Danielle didn't remind them of her title because she needed validation. She reminded them because they needed education. And that lesson? It didn't come with shouting. It came with a calm, poised sentence that hit like a gavel in a courtroom. Not today. Not on my watch. The standard has been set since that moment. Danielle's story has inspired millions. Not just business owners. Not just black women. Not just passengers. Everyone. Because at some point, we've all been underestimated. We've all been judged too quickly. We've all been told, in words or looks, that we don't belong. But Danielle reminded us that we don't have to accept that. We can speak up with grace. We can hold others accountable with calm. We can demand better with dignity. And when we do, we don't just protect ourselves, we set a new standard for everyone who comes next. The real legacy. Danielle didn't want applause. She didn't need followers or headlines. What she wanted, and what she achieved, was a shift in the way people think. She redefined professionalism. She redefined leadership. She redefined how to use power without ever raising your voice. And her legacy? It's not just in her airline. It's in every person who watched that video and felt something change inside them. Who realized, next time they're disrespected, they can speak up, too. Because leadership isn't about titles or corner offices. It's about values. It's about action. And most of all, it's about having the courage to stand tall and say, not today. Not on my watch. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about how we treat others, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. Hit the bell so you never miss a moment that challenges the norm and uplifts real leadership. Until next time, stand tall, speak truth, and stay inspired.